Hi everyone, it's been about a month since I put out my winter forecast back in late November of last year, and I thought that I would do a quick update video as to how the pattern has progressed overall, how it looks to continue into the future, and how that's stacked up with the forecast that I put out back in late November of last year. Taking a look at December, you can see that we had a very warm December, as many of you recall. The core of the warmth was centered right into the Ohio Valley along the Appalachians, and you can see that this was over 8 Celsius above normal. That translates to 15 Fahrenheit above normal. Many locations along the eastern seaboard actually saw temperatures well into the 70s on Christmas Eve, and that corresponded to temperature anomalies or departures from average to be 30 to even 40 degrees above average. This record warm month for many states across the Northeast shattered records mostly set back in 2006, where we saw a similarly warm December, and it roughly counterbalanced the record cold February that we saw earlier last year that many have probably forgotten about by now. You can see that the analog forecast that I put out for December back in late November actually did a very good job forecasting the overall distribution of temperature anomalies, and it did a good job forecasting as to where it would not be above normal. You can see the cooler than normal southwest as a result of the very active storm track into California really put a damper on those positive anomalies into the southwest. You can see that the core of the anomalies was not exactly lined up with the analogs, but analog-based forecasting is looking for the signal itself and not necessarily the magnitude or the exact placement of the warmest anomalies. But as a whole, the analogs did a good job forecasting as to where the warmth would be in the United States itself, and therefore might do a good job with the upcoming few months of winter weather. You can see that with El Nino, we have seen a decline in the subsurface warmth in the eastern tropical Pacific. This is from the Tau Triton sea surface temperature data. You can see that not only has the warm pool been declining, but the cold pool just south of it, just below it, is actually increasing in magnitude, and therefore the headlines that were being posted by several media outlets last week are not correct, because El Nino is no longer strengthening, but it is in fact weakening, and you can see it very clearly with the data. It was 7 Celsius at about 75 meters. It is now just about 5 Celsius. So that is a decline of a couple Celsius in about exactly a month or so, since this was December 3rd right here, and then this was January 2nd right here. So you can see that El Nino overall is on the decline. The QBO is also falling. You can see that the most recent update put it at just below plus 11.5, and that indicates that the winds over the equator are slowly weakening, and that is something that you would want if you want to see a negative North Atlantic oscillation. Specifically, a falling QBO below plus 5 tends to favor a negative North Atlantic oscillation. So we need to watch the trends with the QBO to see whether it would favor such an outcome or not. Now, taking a look at the current and the forecasted outgoing long-wave radiation anomalies, you can see that the forecast anomalies are actually very persistent, with the best convection right around 150 to 160 west. This is different than the east-based years of 1982, 1998, and it is similar to the more central to west-based years of 1958 to 1986, which were among the top years that I put into my analog package. In fact, the October to November average actually had the El Nino as more west-based as opposed to more east-based. So it is certainly following a more 1957-like track as opposed to a more 1997-esque track. And therefore, this would favor a further west Aleutian low. And this is crucial because some particular models, particularly the GFS ensembles, love to push a lot of features too far east in the longer range because it likes to, it has a more of a progressive bias and therefore likes to shove everything further east. And this would argue that the Aleutian low stays where it's put, right near the Aleutians, as opposed to the North Pacific and just south of Alaska. Now, we have a major pattern change on the way. This is not fantasy. This is 8 days from now. You can see the tropospheric polar vortex is actually centered right over the Hudson Bay. This is the GFS ensembles and the Canadian ensembles. You can see that we have a ridge along the west coast. We have an Aleutian low, negative North Atlantic oscillation, and a block into the Arctic basin. This is a very cold pattern, and as a result, we will likely be dealing with a cold wave the second to third week of January, and this will likely seal January as being a colder than normal month, as indicated by now the chilly CFSV2. This model, which was once showing a complete blowtorch for the month of January, has now changed its tune quite significantly and is now showing a very near normal to slightly below normal January, which actually, roughly speaking, agrees with the analogs I put out their forecast for January. You can see that it's near normal for the Appalachian corridor and a cooler than normal southeast with a warmer than normal Midwest into Pacific Northwest. The agreement is actually, quite frankly, astounding. And you can see that this agreement indicates that these analogs could be the right path as to how the pattern will evolve in the coming months. Now, looking at how these analogs evolve for February, March, and how typical daily, Arctic oscillation years for westerly QBO years, that is positive QBO years, and easterly QBO years, or negative QBO years. You can see that positive QBO years tend to see a negative Arctic oscillation for all of February into the first half of March, and that in turn would support this colder than normal February look. This would agree with how we should expect the Arctic oscillation to progress into negative territory for all of February, including a significant portion of March. You can see it also dips down into the later half of March. But you can see March isn't as cold as February, and that's partly because of the fact that we do have a spike into the Arctic oscillation values typically during westerly QBO, westerly QBO years. You can see that we have a very cold signal for February and a fairly cold signal for the southern 2/3 of the country as well. So you can see that we are going to be dealing with a pattern that's very different from the pattern we are currently have been dealing with over the last month or so. Now, I alluded to this earlier in the video. We've had some problems with the long-range modeling, especially with the GEFS. What's really interesting is that when these models, the GEFS, the GFS ensembles, and the Euro ensembles, the closer they get to the forecasted time frame, the less bullish they get with the Aleutian low influence. And I will explain what that means in this slide right here. You can see here was the 0Z run valid 12Z on Sunday. Here's the 12Z run valid 12Z Sunday, 17th of January. Look at the differences along the west coast. You can see that these are subtle but noticeable differences. You can see the 522 height is hundreds of miles different on the 12Z than it is on the 0Z. And that is partly due to the fact that, actually completely due to the fact that this feature is further west than it was on the 0Z. You can see it is suppressing heights along the west coast. And this is a very typical model bias by the GFS to shove the Aleutian low further east, which suppresses heights along the west coast of Canada. That in turn suppresses the trough over the east part of the United States. You can see the 12Z actually shows a fairly decent pattern for cold and potential storminess. You can see that we have a trough into Texas, and what that basically indicates, to me at least, is that you have a continued subtropical jet, a very energetic subtropical jet, and that would match up with forecasts for a very strong positive AAM burst, which would typically indicate that you have a very strong subtropical jet. And that is not too surprising because we have a very strong El Nino still, even though it is weakening. So in conclusion, with the pattern change, storm threats will not immediately follow after the tropospheric improvements, and you will likely see those chances occur slightly later during the January 10th to January 20th timeframe. I suspect that you will see many snow chances during that time frame. And I would argue that the current tropical forcing would favor the Aleutian low to stay west and not continue to barge into West Canada like the GEFS are showing. So the tropospheric pattern change is actually a little bit earlier than I expected. So I expected this to occur during mid-January, but this is the processes that are creating this pattern change actually stemmed from a very, very strong Scandinavian ridge in the troposphere, and as a result, you're seeing major hemispheric weather pattern changes. The Arctic Oscillation is now solidly negative. The PNA is now solidly positive already. So these aren't like forecasted changes that are 300 hours away. These are changes that are occurring right now. And as a result, this pattern change is legitimate. And the tropospheric polar vortex will be split into two pieces. One will be over Hudson Bay. The other one will be over Siberia. The stratospheric polar vortex is still in one piece, and that is because you can see variations in the tropospheric polar vortex, but not necessarily see changes in the stratospheric polar vortex when they are due to two different entities. So if the breakup in the tropospheric polar vortex is due to tropospheric factors, you wouldn't necessarily expect to see the stratospheric polar vortex break up as a result of tropospheric factors. Now, in conclusion with the observations, the analog package did a very good job detecting the overall significant warm signal. The QBO is falling, the El Nino is weakening, and so far everything is fairly much on track with the winter forecast that I put out back in late November. So I see no reason to adjust the winter forecast at all. With the overall mean temperatures, because December was so warm, you might see a overall warm winter temperature overall, and likely you will, but that does not encompass the likely colder than normal January to March that we will likely see as a result of all the factors that I have outlined before. And in conclusion, thank you for listening.